Before we begin, subscribe for more chilling stories and tell me which city you're watching from. I'd love to know. Eleanor received the news of her great-uncle Robert Finch's death with a mixture of surprise and a pang of remorse. Robert had been a distant figure, a reclusive man who vanished from family life decades ago, shortly after her parents' bitter divorce. The only inheritance he left, besides a modest sum of money, was a remote property nestled deep within the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, a simple one-room cabin in the heart of the Willow Creek wilderness. No one in the family, not even her grandmother, Robert's sister, had known of its existence. Eleanor, always intrigued by mysteries, felt a strange impulse to investigate. Family legends painted Robert as an eccentric, perhaps even slightly disturbed, man who had abandoned society to find himself in the wild. Now, Eleanor wondered if there was something more, something darker behind his isolation. She prepared for the journey with unusual meticulousness. The cabin was not easily accessible, requiring a long hike after a gravel road that ended abruptly. She imagined the cabin as a rustic refuge, a place of peace for a man seeking solitude. But as she plotted her route, a creeping apprehension began to set in. The wild, untamed beauty of the Cascades could also harbor forgotten secrets, a kind of solitude that twisted the mind rather than healed it. Her father had spoken little of Robert, only vague recollections of a man who seemed to lose his way after the divorce, uttering cryptic phrases about sacrifice and truth on his last phone call to Eleanor years ago. Now, with Robert gone, Eleanor felt a weight of unspoken questions pressing upon her. The very notion of a hidden cabin, so carefully concealed from his own family, hinted at a life far more complex than anyone had known. She pictured a hermit's dwelling, filled with the mundane detritus of a solitary existence, perhaps a few old books or a dusty fishing rod. What she did not anticipate was the chilling truth hidden within its walls. After a long drive that ended in the small town of Happy Camp, Eleanor was directed by a friendly local towards Cottage Grove, a hub for whitewater rafting companies where she could leave her car overnight. From there, it was a 5-mile trek towards Black Marble Mountain, guided only by a topographical map secured by her uncle's attorney. The hike was arduous, far beyond her usual suburban experiences. Her shirt was soaked with sweat, the unfamiliar terrain led to several wrong turns, and her water supply dwindled rapidly, forcing her to refill her canteen from a stream. The chlorine tablets made the water taste like a swimming pool, a stark contrast to the pristine wilderness around her. Hours blurred into a monotonous rhythm of footsteps, the dense forest closing in on all sides. Then, as the trees began to thin, she finally spotted it. The cabin, a dark, squat silhouette in a distant clearing. It was anything but the luxurious retreat she had once half imagined. Mold-eaten and moss-covered, its front was deeply scored, perhaps by generations of deer using it as a rubbing post. A single small window, devoid of glass or shutter, stared out like a vacant eye, and the roof looked ready to collapse. She tried the door, expecting it to be flimsy, but it proved surprisingly sturdy. Thick planks, heavy metal hinges, and what she soon realized were metal panels nailed to the inner side spoke of an intentional fortification. Stepping inside, her jaw dropped. The interior was a chaotic mosaic of maps plastered across almost every surface. They were heavily annotated with frantic handwriting. Scattered among the maps were spent gas canisters, empty water bottles, and other camping refuse. But what truly seized her attention were the photographs. Dozens of them, some pinned to the walls, others lying on the table or nightstand, depicted the same man. His progression was disturbing. He appeared vibrant and healthy in earlier photos with family, but gradually grew tired, gaunt, and sickly in later self-portraits. Some blurry candid shots showed him disheveled, long-haired, walking barefoot and shirtless through the trees. There were no names, only cryptic annotations on the maps with dates and times. "He's still here," read one, scrawled over a grid square. "Almost saw me, too close." It became chillingly clear. Robert had not been seeking solitude. He had been tracking someone. Eleanor's uneasy curiosity transformed into a creeping dread. This was no ordinary hiker's retreat. Robert had been obsessed. A quick search of the cabin yielded a heavy revolver in a desk drawer, a box of .44 ammunition, and a few empty liquor bottles, just as her mother had vaguely described. There was no running water, no bathroom, only a canvas cot in one corner where Robert had clearly spent countless nights. As dusk painted the forest in long spectral shadows, Eleanor lit her electric lantern and began to meticulously read the maps. The annotations were a descent into paranoia. Found him sleeping here. Human scat? Feeding? ? Each phrase built a mosaic of relentless pursuit. The note, almost saw me, too close, with too close etched in large block letters, sent a shiver down her spine. The gun, the fortified door, the frantic writings, it all clicked. Whatever had happened to this red-haired man, he had posed a profound threat to Robert. And now, by inheriting this place, Eleanor had inherited that threat. The thought of sleeping there, alone in the wilderness, became unbearable. But the encroaching darkness made a hasty escape impossible. Once night had fully descended, Eleanor bolted the cabin door and secured the small glassless shutter, trying in vain to find comfort on the cot. Sleep eventually claimed her, a brief reprieve shattered around 2:30 a.m. by a noise. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the cabin's shadowy interior. Relief washed over her when she realized the sound came from outside, a cautious movement in the undergrowth. She first thought it an animal, drawn by the smell of food, but as she listened, a steady bipedal shuffle emerged, too confident, too deliberate to be a creature of the wild. Eleanor moved swiftly, instinctively grabbing the revolver from the desk. Though no expert with firearms, she knew how to load and operate it. An animal might be scared off. A lone person in the dead of night was a different kind of danger. She then moved to the shuttered window, throwing it open and shining her flashlight into the blackness. Its beam cut a wide arc, illuminating the area directly in front of the cabin. The rhythmic shuffling grew louder, closer, moving into her field of vision. Eleanor pointed the light to the trees on her right. After a few agonizing seconds, a figure shuffled into view. He was completely naked, his pale skin visible only in patches through a covering of dirt and grime. His long red hair was matted and wild, and she caught a glimpse of an equally unkempt beard. It was the man from the photographs. He did not react to the blinding beam, simply continued his slow, methodical circle of the cabin. For what felt like an eternity, Eleanor could only watch, frozen in a stunned silence. Then, he stopped, standing perfectly still like a grotesque statue. The silence became unbearable. "Hey!" Eleanor called out, her voice trembling despite her effort to project authority. "I'm warning you, I have a gun in here." The man remained motionless, save for a subtle sway. Then, without warning, he lunged, sprinting toward the cabin door with a terrifying, unnatural speed. Eleanor slammed the shutter shut, stumbling backward from the wall, the revolver aimed squarely at the door. The metal panels on the inner side of the door now made a chilling, undeniable sense. She expected a violent bash, but just as his footsteps reached the door, they stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Eleanor, her voice strained, reminded him of the gun, threatening dire consequences if he attempted entry. No reply. Only the dead quiet for a minute or two before a soft, insistent knocking began. At first, barely audible, it grew steadily louder, heavier with each repetition. She initially thought it a fist, but the impact felt too broad, too blunt, and it was precisely at head height. He wasn't banging with his fist. He was smashing his head against the thick wooden paneling, again and again. "Stop it!" she screamed, staring at the scarred metal plates. "Jesus Christ, this has happened before, hasn't it?" As the man relentlessly battered the door, Eleanor yelled, "I'm not my dad. He's dead. He passed away." Her words were choked with terror, drawn out and desperate, but she drove the point home. Robert was gone, and she wasn't staying. The moment she declared it, the banging ceased. Dead silence. Then, a raspy croak from outside, a voice raw and unused, whispered, "Robert?" It was unmistakably her father's name. Eleanor, fear seizing her, repeated that her father was deceased, promising to leave at dawn and never return. The only reply was another, slightly louder croak of, "Robert." She screamed then, shouting about Robert's death, her ignorance of his purpose, and her own harmless intentions. She braced for another repetition. But the silence stretched until faint footsteps began to recede, growing gradually quieter, fading into the vast, indifferent darkness. The silence that followed felt like a broken spell. Eleanor could move again, but she couldn't stop. There was no way she would spend another moment in that cabin. She frantically packed her meager belongings, ensuring her compass pointed west, and stumbled out into the pre-dawn gloom. As she exited, the cabin door caught the beam of her flashlight, revealing a horrific sheen of what appeared to be dried saliva, or possibly blood, coating its surface. The night hike that followed was a descent into pure primal terror. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, every shifting shadow at the periphery of her flashlight beam became the naked red-haired man. An owl's distant hoot sent her spinning, the revolver clutched in her trembling hands. She honestly believed she would have to kill a man that night, and thanked a silent God that it did not come to pass. True safety eluded her until she was back in her car, the engine purring to life, and the cabin a rapidly fading speck in her rearview mirror. Back home, having gone without sleep for over 24 hours, Eleanor was still wired, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, delaying any thought of rest until late that afternoon. She called the ranger headquarters in Yukon, reporting what she had seen. She conveyed her concern for the man's well-being, mentioning her late father's possible involvement in searching for a missing person. She deliberately omitted the frantic tracking, the detailed observations, and certainly the horrifying head-smashing encounter of the previous night. She merely stated that the individual seemed dangerous. She didn't want to be dismissed as a crazy attention seeker. When the ranger finally spoke, his words were a shock. Eleanor wasn't the first to report a red-headed wild man in those woods. She wouldn't be the last. Reports stretched back 15 years, coincidentally aligning with the period of her parents' divorce. To date, the man had never physically harmed anyone, only given them a fright with his lack of clothing and strange behavior. Eleanor asked if Robert's name appeared in any of the old reports. The ranger said no. Before hanging up, he offered a theory. Perhaps the man was an old friend of Robert's, now lost and looking for him. Eleanor found it possible, yet unlikely. Her mother had never recognized the man's description. It was at this point that Eleanor recognized the insidious pull, the dangerous allure of the unknown that had consumed her father. The cabin, the maps, the mystery, it beckoned. She pictured herself falling down that same rabbit hole of obsession, alone, drinking, consumed by the pursuit until she too met an early end. She put the cabin on the market. It was sold as a parcel of land at a heavy discount, purely to be rid of it. The thought of sending an appraiser out there, risking another encounter with the wild man, was unbearable. Eleanor knew she couldn't live with herself if someone else went there and never returned. The mystery of Robert Finch and the man in the woods remained, a chilling echo in the silent legacy of Willow Creek. Grace Whitaker always found her grandfather, Thomas, to be a peculiar man. Not cruel, not distant, just made of older weather. He kept his shortwave radio in the kitchen that spoke to him in Morse, and he trusted barometers more than calendars. In Denver, Colorado, the mountains begin as a soft blue rumor and then harden into the Rockies as you drive west. In Thomas's small house on the city's edge, they weren't scenery, but company that could turn its head. He never liked lights on at night. He hated loose ends and loved knots. When he turned 88, he asked Grace Whitaker to visit before winter sets its teeth. And when she came by on a wind-torn afternoon, he was waiting in his old chair with an oil lamp lit and a cloth bundle on his knees. He told her there was a thing he had been meaning to bury properly, and that he had run out of seasons to do it. He said, "This is the truth," and looked at her in a way that made her colder than the draft. She had always thought the truth in families meant small, sour things, an affair, a debt, a womb you pretend is a joke. But as Thomas loosened the cord around the bundle and began the story, the pieces slowly, chillingly fell into place. Back when the financial world collapsed and Thomas was still a boy living in a cabin to the west, the mountains were meaner, the winters longer, and a person's luck had a sound. His father didn't come home one night, and after 3 days and the white hiss of searching, the neighbors stopped bringing meat. Thomas learned to split wood without counting inches. He learned the size of hunger and the size of a lie. His mother took in laundry and prayed toward the hills. One afternoon, a Model A coughed its way up the rutted track, and 2 men stepped out wearing city shoes that sank in the mud. They were not polite in the way city men pretend to be. They were polite in the way a knife is polite before it enters flesh. They told Thomas's mother that her late husband had owed them a favor long before he was late, and favors accrue interest like snow. They said there was a chest the man had kept, and that it belonged to them. His mother told them she had never seen a chest. They smiled without moving their faces and said they would give her a week to remember. For a week, Thomas listened to the woods the way you listen to a clock when the house is empty. On the 8th day, the men came back at dusk when the stove's last light looked like an eye. They didn't knock. They opened drawers and lifted floorboards with practiced hands and laughed at each other's jokes that had no punchlines. They left with nothing and said they would return. Several days later, as Thomas picked his way along the creek that wore its winter skin thin and tight, he saw claw marks at the base of an old aspen. Sharp, deliberate bites into the pale bark, a set of triangles arranged like a joke he didn't get. He followed the pattern the way you follow the smell of something burning, and found a shallow spot beneath a rock where someone had cut neat squares into the earth. Inside, 3 cloth sacks lay like small animals asleep. Within them, dozens of solid gold coins, not bright like the first day of a cartoon, but dull with the kind of authority that does not need to shine. Thomas knew enough to hide the sacks again and walk home like he had found a feather. The men returned that night. They brought a shovel this time and a new tone to their voices as they asked whether a boy had been in the woods. His mother stood straight and quiet and held a kitchen knife with the tenderness one uses for a baby. Thomas said he had seen fox tracks and nothing else. The men left with the promise to come back when the snow softened and the ground forgot their last steps. In the spring, Thomas moved the sacks twice, and then a third time when a bear tore up the creek bank and changed the grammar of the dirt. He built a false floor under the shed and learned to look at people's hands before he looked at their eyes. He grew into a man who could carry weight and never let it show in his shoulders. When the war came and went, when the city grew teeth and money learned new tricks, he brought the sacks down from the mountain piece by piece and turned the coins into quieter things. A mortgage paid on time, a used truck that always started, a college fund that stayed unnamed until the day he signed the envelope. He never spent it all. He never told anyone why he could. He kept a few coins in a jar under the sink to give weight to a certain memory. Now, in the house on Denver's edge, he pushed the cloth bundle across his knees toward Grace Whittaker and said, "They were never mine." He told her where the aspen had been and where its grandchildren would be. He told her the shape of the rock and the way to find the false floor, if it ever mattered. He said he had learned that some debts bend with time and some do not, and that there were men who would still be interested in a story like this if they had lived long enough to be old. He asked her to take the last coins and put them where men with city shoes could not find them, not for the money, but so the boy he had been could stop watching the door when the wind changed. Grace Whittaker took the bundle with hands that were steadier than the lamp flame and felt the weight that had kept a man upright for 8 decades. She could hear the river in the metal the way some people hear seas inside shells. She said she would make it right, although right was a country you never reach on foot. In the weeks that followed, she drove west and stood under the kind of sky that makes you understand why people worship distance. She found a grove where the aspens shared a root and listened to their leaves talk among themselves. She buried what remained and left no marker. Back in Denver, she sat with Thomas through his last winter and kept the lamp lit when the power went out. On the night he slipped away, the barometer fell hard and then steadied. She held his hand and told him about the aspen's grandchildren and the way the creek sounded against the rock. He nodded once, like a man hearing an address he had always known. After, in the living room, she unrolled the cloth and counted 3 coins she had kept back. Not for money, but because memory needs an anchor. She put one on the windowsill to hold the edge of a letter. She carried one in her coat pocket for weight on days the city felt too thin. The last she placed in a jar under the sink. She did not lock her doors any more than before, but when strangers with neat shoes came to the porch selling alarms or politics, she watched their hands first and their eyes second. She told no one the full story. At night, when the wind came down off the mountains with its old, earned voice, she would hear the smallest clink below the sink and think of the cabin and the boy and the men who wanted what wasn't theirs. She would think of the word truth and understand that sometimes it isn't a confession or a fact. Sometimes it is 3 cloth sacks that bought time, and a promise kept in the ground, and a granddaughter who said yes. Rest in peace, grandfather. In September of 1993, a group of college friends, Liam, Mark, Chloe, and Ben, were poised to begin their junior year. For almost a year, they had talked about a camping trip, a final hurrah before the academic grind. They chose Olympic National Park, easily accessible from Seattle, combining it with the bordering Olympic National Forest to immerse themselves in one of the lower 48's largest wilderness areas. Their plan was ambitious. Drive out on Thursday the 2nd, spend 3 days living wild, then return on Monday the 6th. High spirits filled the car as they journeyed towards their destination. After a quick lunch stop, they arrived at Fairholme, a small town with a general store and a campground. This would be their staging ground, their first night stop before venturing into the trails the following morning. From Fairholme, they envisioned a hike to a distant lookout, enjoying breathtaking views from a mountain campsite, then a leisurely return through what was rumored to be a lush rainforest, a landscape so vibrant it was described as stepping onto an untamed planet. The first night was filled with camaraderie and laughter. The next morning, fueled by excitement, they ventured into the fabled rainforest, confident in their direction. The range of hills they aimed for was impossible to miss, making the idea of getting truly lost seem laughable. Yet, as the hours wore on, a subtle unease began to creep in. They realized they weren't on the trails they had meticulously planned for. Though their general westward heading would eventually lead them to the lookout, the dense canopy of ancient trees obscured all recognizable landmarks. They were walking through an endless green labyrinth, directionally aware, but geographically blind. After what felt like an eternity of navigating the unyielding forest, they stumbled upon it. A cabin, so weathered and worn, it was almost camouflaged against the backdrop of towering pines. Its roof was matted with dead leaves, vines snaked up one side, and the glassless windows were so caked with grime they appeared to hold clouds within their murky depths. It seemed utterly abandoned. Peering through the grimy panes, they saw the interior was littered with what looked like old camping gear. A crumbled sheet of aluminum foil, a half-empty box of matches, and a dented tin can with a spoon crusted in dried beans lay on a rickety table. Torn granola bar wrappers and a spilled bag of trail mix were scattered across the floor. An unzipped, stained sleeping bag slumped against the wall next to a pile of damp firewood that had never made it to the stone fireplace. Pushing open the unlocked door, Liam found a deck of playing cards scattered across the floor, as if a game had been abruptly abandoned mid-play. Faint carvings adorned the walls, initials, dates, crude sketches. They unanimously concluded it was a hiker's stopover, a perfect respite for a few hours before continuing their journey to the lookout. After sweeping away some of the debris with their boots and broken branches, they settled in to eat lunch. After their makeshift lunch on the porch, heated by their small camp stove, Liam decided to explore the cabin further. He hoped to salvage something from the forgotten belongings. The main room offered only trash, so he ventured into the small bedroom. Mark had already glanced inside, but put off by the thick cobwebs, hadn't bothered with the drawers of the old nightstand. The stained mattress in the corner reeked of rot and dampness, a smell so potent, Liam almost covered his nose and mouth as he opened the first drawer. Inside, a used condom. He slammed the drawer shut, repulsed. The second drawer held several empty glass medicine bottles with faded prescription labels. But in the third, nestled amongst dust and decay, he discovered a leather-bound notebook. Pulling it out, he opened it to reveal a journal, its first entry dated 1978. Liam initially dismissed it as a forgotten hiker's log, probably filled with mundane observations or bad poetry. Yet, as he read the opening words, he found himself captivated. The author, embarking on what he termed the adventure of a lifetime, detailed his plan to live off the grid, convinced of his incompatibility with modern society, believing true happiness lay in self-sufficiency amidst nature. The journal was intended as a guide, a beacon for others seeking to escape the clutches of modernity. Liam, thrilled by his discovery, envisioned publication. He rushed back to the main room, eager to share his find. Chloe and Ben, engrossed in attempting to clear the cabin's clogged chimney, offered only dismissive shrugs. But Mark, his eyes wide, exclaimed, "Really? No way!" They settled on the porch steps, Liam beginning to read aloud. The early entries, as Liam had noted, laid out the author's philosophical motivations and practical plans for his self-imposed exile. As Liam read on, the journal shifted, detailing the raw, nitty-gritty of survival. They found an entry describing the day he ran out of store-bought provisions, forced to rely solely on his hunting, fishing, and foraging skills. It was terrifying yet exhilarating to read of the author's growing contentment as his efforts bore fruit. A chilling passage recounted his accidental poisoning from undercooked game, leaving him gravely ill for days. Liam felt the author's raw anxiety, his fear of succumbing to such a mundane end. Relief came when a later entry confirmed his recovery. Mark, however, began to grow restless, eventually excusing himself to help Chloe and Ben with the fireplace. Liam continued reading alone, turning the pages of destiny. Unsurprisingly, many entries became repetitive, describing the same routine with minor variations. Liam skimmed, seeking longer, more compelling passages. He watched as 1979 bled into 1980, the entries becoming less frequent. Then, as 1981 gave way to 1982, the writing style underwent a dramatic transformation. Elegant prose degenerated into something primitive, no longer addressing a reader, but a desperate internal monologue, almost a plea to a higher power. Long, rambling paragraphs spoke of hearing the sky sing in the profound silence, of the unsettling sensation of slaughtering a rabbit feeling like a perverse act of self-sacrifice. He was no longer seeking a new way of living, but a desperate salvation for his soul in some cosmic battle between good and evil. It was clear the isolation was taking its toll. The author recognized his deteriorating mental state, acknowledging the need for human contact, a return to civilization. Yet, he wrote of an insurmountable hatred for regular people, their wasteful and mindless existence. It was a tragic tale, this quest for enlightenment twisting into bitterness and reclusion. As the mid-1980s turned into the latter half of the decade, the entries ceased to be merely sad. They became terrifying. Later passages were short, clipped, and filled with a raw, primal anger, the letters scratched into the page with furious intensity. By 1989, some entries were no longer discernible script, but chaotic squiggles, a private shorthand only the author could decipher. When recognizable words appeared, they were curses or grotesque compound terms: kill death, blood god, sick brain. The author railed against God, believing something had gone catastrophically wrong with the world, preventing him from playing the game any longer. One line, jumbled and fragmented, reads something like, "I am not what I am. I am not my offense. I am a cosmic being, and the truth of my rules are the way of the next revealed." It felt like garbled, almost computer-generated text, as if his internal processing unit was failing. Other recurring phrases like, "I am finished," "It is finished," "I must finish it," echoed a sense of terrifying finality. That was the last of what Liam could fully comprehend. The remaining pages were filled with more intricate, deliberate shorthand, a language born of madness. He expected the entries to end, for the author to succumb to his fractured mind or abandon his quest. Instead, they continued, growing even more chilling. Fewer in number, sometimes only one a month, they persisted into 1990, 1991, and 1992. Then, as Liam thought, "No way has this guy been out here since the 70s. He turned a page to see 1993 roughly scrawled above another long track of symbols and squiggles. This story, he remembered with a jolt, was set in September of that very year. The final entries, appearing almost fresh, contained cryptic mentions of the approaching fall. A wave of raw panic washed over him. They weren't in a random hiker's rest stop. They were in someone's cabin, and that someone was dangerously insane. Liam burst into the main room, his face pale, his voice urgent. "Yo, we have to get out of here now." His friends, confused by his sudden terror, bombarded him with questions. "What? Why? What's up? What happened?" He didn't have time to explain the journal's descent into madness. "We shouldn't be here," he insisted, his voice cracking. "This is someone's place and they're crazy." A brief moment of skepticism hung in the air. "How could you even know that?" Chloe asked. "There's a journal," Liam stammered, flipping through the later pages to reveal the chaotic scribbles and symbols. The horror on his friends' faces confirmed they finally understood the gravity of the situation. They abandoned their efforts to start a fire, the mood shifting instantly from carefree adventure to desperate flight. They moved as fast as their legs could carry them, heads swiveling, praying they wouldn't encounter the journal's author. With each hurried explanation Liam offered, his friends grew more panicked, wondering what such a deranged individual might do if he found them in his home. They hiked until exhaustion claimed them, the distant lookout finally appearing on the horizon. Too weary to scale it that night, they agreed to camp a little further up the valley, putting more distance between themselves and the ominous cabin. After setting up their tents, the easy camaraderie of their trip was shattered. The woods, once a playground, now felt like a sinister labyrinth, every shadow hiding a dark and dangerous secret. They were unarmed, a grave oversight they now deeply regretted. Back then, they were merely hikers, not adventurers braving a wild frontier with muskets drawn. Now, the fear they felt was the price of their naivete. Though confident they were far enough from the cabin and bolstered by their numbers, 4 against 1, the confidence waned with the setting sun. As darkness enveloped them, they huddled around their campfire, every rustle, every creak of the forest a potential threat. The anxiety peaked when someone voiced the chilling thought, what if he was tracking them? The man was clearly unhinged, and he had lived in these woods long enough to be a skilled hunter and tracker. They, an unarmed group, had made no effort to conceal their path. The terrifying possibility of him stalking them through the night sent shivers down their spines. They remained on edge for most of the night. Around 11 p.m., a lull fell over their conversation, the crackling campfire their only companion. Liam, surprisingly, felt a flicker of relaxation. If the madman from the cabin intended to track them, he surely would have caught up by now. Perhaps he was far off, only returning to his cabin sporadically to sleep on that foul-smelling mattress. But just as this hopeful thought took root, a scream tore through the stillness of the valley, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the trees, a primal blend of a howl and a roar. It was a cry filled with rage and madness, yet also profound pain. Whoever made that noise was beyond self-control, beyond reason. The sheer sound of it terrified them. The scream had barely faded when Mark whispered, "That's him." There was no debate, no denial. They knew precisely who had uttered that chilling sound. There was no way they could remain in that spot. They doused the fire, hastily packed their tents and gear, and began a non-stop trek back towards the general store where their car awaited. By then, the first light of dawn was creeping over the eastern hills, a sight that felt like salvation. They spoke little on the return journey. Someone suggested they should have taken the journal as proof, but the others agreed that stealing it would have only further enraged the man, guaranteeing a relentless pursuit through the woods. Yet, having heard that scream echo across the valley, Liam doubted he could have gotten any angrier. Knowing his home had been disturbed, even today, he thanks God that the man did not track them down. He tries not to think about what might have happened had that man found them.
Megan Carter grew up in a small town in Missoula, Montana. As a teenager, she sometimes envied the distant thrum of city life, but she loved the deep quiet that fell over the valley on cold nights. The mountains stood like sleeping giants, and the pines hissed in the wind as if sharing some private joke with the moon. Those early years taught her to recognize a certain kind of silence, the kind that wasn't empty, the kind that pressed in from the dark like a held breath. That instinct, half fear, half intuition, never left her, even after she moved away. Years later, while living on the edge of Leavenworth, Washington, she picked up a seasonal night job at Timberline Hideaway, a rustic lodge perched at the end of a narrow road. Summer had ended, tourists had thinned, and the owners wanted someone steady at the front desk as the first snows crept down from the ridges. Megan Carter liked the stillness, the way the river dulled into a low hush after midnight, the sense of wet cedar when the doors swung open and shut. She told herself the job would be simple: check-ins, coffee at dawn, a logbook, a smile. On her second week, a reunion group booked the entire northern loop of cabins, 10 families spread out among the pines, all with shared high school history and uneasy adult smiles. They brought coolers, string lights, an acoustic guitar, and the kind of laughter that feels a little forced until the second night. Megan Carter watched them from the desk, recognizing patterns: who hung back, who smiled too hard, who drank first. The first night passed without incident. On the second, the quiet changed. It happened around 1 a.m. The river noise seemed to fold inward. The night lost its layers. Megan Carter stood at the window and looked at the dark courtyard between the office and the cabins. The string lights were off. Somewhere far off, a fox barked once and then thought better of it. She told herself she was hearing the snow lines settle on the ridgeline. She told herself she was tired. Then Cabin 9's porch light flickered on and stayed on. She waited for the door to open. It didn't. No one stepped out onto the porch. The light hummed and held. A minute later, a woman came in from the side path, hugging her sweater tight, breath pluming in the cold. Her name tag from the reunion lanyard bounced against her chest. Tasha. She leaned in the office doorway and asked for bottled water. Her eyes didn't quite meet Megan Carter's. Her throat looked too tight when she swallowed. Megan Carter fetched water from the mini fridge and slid it across the counter. "You okay?" she asked. Tasha nodded too quickly, said, "Long night,"
and left without asking about a price. The porch light at cabin 9 went out. The quiet reset, but not to where it had been. Megan Carter wrote the time and the detail in the logbook, habit from an old training manual, and forced herself to read for 20 minutes from a paperback that wouldn't keep. The reunion's noise thinned to occasional footsteps and the sound of a door that didn't want to latch. At 2:15, the phone rang. The caller ID showed cabin 4. A man's voice, rough with drink and smoke, said, "She shouldn't be in there." He didn't give a name. He didn't say who she was. He hung up before she could ask. Megan Carter stared at the phone and heard the river again, like a line on a heart monitor. She checked the cabin's list. Cabin 9 belonged to Caleb and Aaron, wedding photos, ask in the morning. Cabin 4 was Marcus and Dev. On the clipboard, someone had drawn a triangle next to cabin 9's number. No explanation. The triangle felt like a little door into a memory she didn't want. She closed the clipboard and stepped outside. The cold hit the inside of her nose.
The path gravel made a soft static under her shoes. She was not supposed to leave the office unattended, but tonight the policy felt like a rumor from another place. She walked to cabin 9 and stood on the bottom step of the porch. The door was shut. No light seeped around the edges. She knocked once. Listening to wood carried the sound into the room. Nothing. She knocked again. Somewhere in the dark behind her, a bottle rolled and stopped against the root. Leaves flashed and settled. She put her ear to the door. Breath. Not sleep breath, a pause breath. She said, "Front desk," in a voice that sounded like someone else's. The door opened 2 inches. A woman's face hovered in the gap, eyes wet and wide. Aaron, if the clipboard was right. "We're fine," she said. Her teeth clicked on the F. "We're sleeping." The door closed softly. Megan Carter stood very still and counted her own heartbeats. She did not like the count. On the way back, she passed cabin 4. The curtains there were open a slit. Inside, the man who had called, she assumed, sat on the edge of a bed, elbows on knees, face in his hands. He lifted his head when she paused and met her stare with the look she recognized from high school hallways and parking lot fights. The expression of someone who had already decided that the next moment would be the one that mattered most or least. "It's not a drink," he said, as if continuing a conversation. "It's not about drinking." He nodded toward 9. "It's about poison." The words sat wrong in the nights and didn't echo. Megan Carter walked back to the office and pretended to tidy the brochure rack. At 3, the quiet broke with a small sound that felt too much like a note being struck and held. The office phone rang again. Cabin 7, a woman's voice, thinner and higher, said, "I heard someone in the trees. Then, I think it was a man. I think he was wearing a mask." Megan Carter flipped the porch light on and off in a gesture of reassurance she knew was meaningless at this distance. "Stay inside," she said. "Lock the door." She stepped out with a flashlight and traced the beam along the tree line. The light found nothing. The trees stood like a jury. She tracked the beam low, over roots and needles and the dark scrape of a path that ducked behind the cabins. The path led toward 9. Footprints marked in the dirt looked wrong. Not too large, not clawed, just soft at the edges, as if whoever had left them had walked very carefully. The flashlight licked the porch steps and died. The batteries had been good at midnight. She tapped the barrel once and the light jittered and went black. The dark felt loud. From inside 9, a small thump. Then another. The triangle on the clipboard in her head lit up like a brand. She went back to the office on a pace just slower than running and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, Megan Carter heard herself say, "Something is wrong in cabin 9. And then she was telling the story, clean and calm. The porch light, the knock, the voice from 4, the footprints, the call from 7. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in immediate danger. The correct answer was, "I don't know." But what she said was, "Yes." The first red wash of lights reached the lower lot at 3:21. The sheriff's SUV slid to a stop and a deputy stepped out with a hand to his belt and the lean patience of someone who had driven too many miles for too many small-town midnights. 2 minutes later, an ambulance's white glare painted the trees flat. The deputy spoke low with Megan Carter at the office door, took notes, and headed to 9 with EMTs. She stood behind the glass and watched the porch swallow them. The door opened. A stretch of silence replaced the lodge's quiet. When the EMTs came back, one carried a small, empty bottle in a gloved hand. The deputy's radio hissed and murmured. At dawn, the reunion's laughter had been replaced by the sound of people calling names, as if they could change the outcome by speaking faster. By noon, most of the group had packed and left without looking at the office. The owners arrived with faces set to a public shape. The sheriff's tape fluttered and then sagged. That evening, alone again at the desk, Megan Carter opened the logbook and wrote what she could without writing anyone's secrets. Timestamps, light flickers, soft steps, a word that did not echo. She closed the book and went to the window and pressed her fingertips to the glass where the night pressed back. The river found its voice. For a long time after, when the valley settled and the pines hissed and the mountains breathed like sleeping things, she would stand in the office doorway and listen for the sound of a porch light clicking on. She never said the word out loud again. But sometimes, when the night sank all at once and the quiet changed, she thought about the way the man in 4 had said it, and how he wasn't talking about a drink. He was referring to cabin number 9. She relayed her realization to the dispatcher, ensuring an ambulance would be sent immediately. When the responders arrived, they found more than one person in distress, injured. Megan Carter's first instinct was to call 911. The dispatch operator, calm and professional, needed to know the cabin. She told the deputy everything she could, gave statements twice, and then as the day cooled again and the pines began their whispering, she stood in the doorway of the office and understood that what had happened did not begin that night and would not end with the tape coming down. Ultimately, it wasn't just one ambulance that screeched up the winding road, but several, and the reunion, so eager to rekindle old warmth, dissolved into a scatter of cars with their trunks open and eyes red. The porch light at cabin 9 clicked off sometime near sunset. The quiet returned to its original shape. The river kept its counsel. Months later, Megan Carter would still find herself reaching for the switch in the office when the night went thin and the air pressed close. And each time, she would remember that a triangle beside a number can mean more than a mark on paper. It can be a door, or a warning, or a story that never wanted to be told. One that stayed in Missoula and followed her to Leavenworth and taught her again what kind of silence is not empty at all, but full of things that move without sound and of truths that could lurk beneath the surface of seemingly normal lives.
Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more terrifying stories.